Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today on how to stay safe with remote access in 5 easy steps. Allow me to introduce our presenters for this afternoon. We have Andrew Woodhouse, our Chief Information Officer here at RealVNC, and Ben May, our Head of Cyber Security. Now, before I hand over to them, I just want to run through a few housekeeping items with you. Firstly, today's webinar is being recorded, so we'll share a link to the recording once we've wrapped everything up. Also, everyone's microphones have been muted and your camera's disabled. If you have any questions for us, if you look on your screens, you should be able to see on the right-hand side a chat panel. So if you need to reach us, please use kind of the private chat feature there and message one of the admins. You'll also see there's a Q&A option on the chat panel, and we are going to have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So at any point during the webinar, please pop your questions in there, and we'll put them to Andrew and Ben once we get to that step. So yes, without further ado, let me hand over to Andrew and Ben for their presentation.
Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us. So what we're going to do today is we're going to spend about half an hour or so with a 10-minute Q&A at the end, just considering the 5 easy steps or the 5 things that should be considered when choosing a remote access vendor, deploying remote access software, and managing that remote access software. So as you can see on the slide, the first thing we're going to talk about is encryption, and it's not as simple as is the connection encrypted. So there's other things that should be considered, which Ben's going to talk about. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about authentication. So authentication is quite a big area for us at RealVNC because, as we're moving into a zero trust model, it's significantly more complicated than just having a single password. And then Ben's going to talk about the advantages of using cloud brokered connections and why they are generally a good thing. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about policies, both policies, sort of IT policies, and then policies which you should be kind of managing with your remote access software, so enforced policies. And then finally, we're going to be talking about really something that you should be demanding from remote access vendors, which is all about transparency and them backing up their claims of security. So with no further ado, I'll hand over to Ben to talk about encryption.
Thanks, Andrew. So there's a reason why encryption is number 1 on the topic of items to consider when choosing a remote access solution. And that's because, this is an absolute no-brainer. It's an absolute baseline, the first thing that you should be considering, the first thing you should be looking at. And in fact, in today's age, most vendors, I can't really talk about the competitors, but most vendors are secure out of the box. Gone are the days of having to deploy and configure things too much. Things should be secure out of the box. You don't usually see telnet, FTP, that kind of thing, unencrypted connections. You don't really see out in the public, or you'd hope not to anyway. They're not impossible to see. So really, this encryption's on here because this is going beyond just ticking that box. This is going beyond just saying, is encryption enabled, yes or no? This is about asking your vendor, more detail. When a vendor says they're encrypted and they have that tick box on their, on their website, what does that actually mean? Which area of the software is encrypted? Quite often you get a web portal, you get some web APIs on the back end, and of course the client software itself. Are all areas encrypted? And that's absolutely should be. But start asking those questions about what type of encryption is on which areas and what that really means. So again, we go into more detail. End-to-end encryption. This is a term you may hear in the mainstream media when talking about Apple iMessages or WhatsApp, this kind of thing. Talking about messaging solutions being end-to-end encrypted. But actually, remote access software should absolutely be end-to-end encrypted, because what this does is creates a tunnel between one client to the other and enforces, stops anyone from either viewing or modifying any of the network traffic in between there. And you can see on the slide, it says who holds the keys So if you talk about things like perfect forward secrecy, what this means is there's a unique key per connection. So even if your connection was recorded, the encrypted part of it, it means that in the future, that connection couldn't be decrypted to see what actually, happened inside. These things, of course, are all focusing on data in transit and the encryption around those. But of course, there's data at rest as well. And you really need to be asking the questions, how is your data stored? Where is it stored? And how is that encrypted? And that's why the final point there is one of our key security pillars at RealVNC is that every connection is treated as though it's made within a hostile environment. So really, asking the question, is it technically possible for your connection to be intercepted and viewed or modified? Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Ben. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about authentication, because one thing any of you who work in IT know, and anyone who reads the press about some of the recent cyber attacks and data exfiltrations will know that very often people are actually the weak link. So, we are human, we're flesh and bone, we have brains that forget things, we have very often poor password policies. Sometimes we write our passwords down, sometimes we share our passwords between different systems. And obviously that's particularly bad, because if I have a Gmail password of I Love Misty and I use that password for my remote access password to my work systems, then if my email gets hacked, then very often credential stuff in the text will happen where they try other systems and try and get into those systems using those credentials that have leaked out. So what we strongly recommend you do when looking at a remote access vendor is consider how the authentication works. Ben mentioned one of our security pillars. Another security pillar we have at RealVNC is that the server ultimately decides who connects. If you imagine, for example, that you are trusting the remote access vendor through their role-based access controls that may be very, very secure, if they get compromised, potentially they can get onto your systems because of a weakness that they had that may be caused by a third party, or it may be a very long and complicated chain of exploits that happen to them. But the last thing you want to do is means that your systems are vulnerable. So one of our security pillars is the server is always in charge. We also recommend layering of authentication. So for example, username and password, we all know is fine, but it's a kind of flawed model because, as I said, people share passwords, they have weak password policies, they do all the things that we as humans do. What you really want to be looking for, and what we would strongly recommend, is that you implement multi-factor authentication. For those of you who are RealVNC customers, for example, hopefully you know that we support Radius, we support push notifications, so that for each connection you get a prompt asking you to approve that. We've also recently introduced single sign-on authentication, again meaning the user doesn't need to remember credentials for 20, 30, 50, 100 systems that we're all dealing with that have passwords. If staff are signing in with the same set of credentials everywhere, it's much easier for them to manage the passwords. It's easier for you to have password policies. And then, with Azure AD, for example, something like conditional access, you can layer additional policies just to, again, mitigate the risk of people being human. Okay. So just to summarize then, look at what authentication options are available. Don't expect users to manage lots of passwords and have good password discipline. So mitigate those, layer the authentication with things like multi-factor authentication. If you can use, if you're an Azure AD customer and you're a VNC Connect customer, use something like Azure AD to make it easier for staff to manage their authentication across all the different systems that you have. And finally, consider who is making the decision as to who can connect. not only connection, yes or no, but what permissions they get, and do some threat modeling. We would recommend, consider what happens if your remote access vendor gets compromised. Does that mean that your systems can be compromised? We can say confidently with VNC Connect that that can't happen. But if you're not a VNC Connect customer, obviously we'd like you to talk to us, but we would strongly recommend with your current remote access vendor asking that question. And that's it for authentication. As I said, we've got some questions at the end. And if anyone wants to see the push notification demo, I can show that at the end. But for now, I'll hand over to Ben to talk about cloud brokered connections.
Thanks, Andrew. So when talking about the cloud, this is obviously a term that's used in an umbrella term that's used in many different. What we're going to be focused on here is cloud, how you can use the cloud to kind of enhance the security of your remote access solution. So it says there at the top, so Microsoft Remote Desktop Protocol, RDP, this is a direct access solution. So what this means is if you want to access your machine from outside, from the internet, so from outside your network, you would have to open ports, you would have to, make changes to your firewall to make that connection be allowed. And what this actually means is that your server is therefore accessible and discoverable on the internet. In fact, last year there was the Colonial Pipeline data breach. It was quite a big event. It was across all the news, and it turns out that from an investigation into this, it was RDP that was the initial access vector. This was actually because not only was it available on the internet, but there was no built-in brute force protection. So someone was able to repeatedly try different passwords in a loop until they got in. And in fact, I think in this case, it was a reused password. So again, going back to what Andrew was saying about authentication and password policies. So really, cloud brokered connections turns that around. What happens with a remote access software solution which has cloud brokered connections is there is a server out on the internet, and instead of opening firewalls, instead of exposing yourself on the internet, the connections between the two clients are outbound connections. So there's various technologies under the hood, stun and ice and NAT hole punching, which I'm sure we can go into more detail another time. But really what this enables is connections in places without needing to open the firewall, without needing to be actively, directly on the internet. And of course, with some solutions such as VNC Connect, there is other advantages. So by having a VNC account, you can configure things on a VNC account level. You can add permissions. And again, going back to Andrew's case, you can add different authentication options on your VNC account directly. The last item there on the list is, of course, direct connections are still useful in scenarios where you may have a secure network, you may have a network which doesn't have external internet access, and then therefore, direct access is definitely still available and definitely something that we still support where customers require. So the next slide here, this is a screenshot from a website called shodan.io. So if anyone hasn't seen this before, Shodan is a search engine for internet connected machines. So similar to how Google you can use as a search engine to search for web pages, Shodan you can look for internet connected machines. And what I'm showing here is I've done a quick search for port 3389, which is the RDP port, and it's showing in the top left that there is over 4 million machines directly connectable on the internet via RDP. And if you were to enable RDP on your network, then it would highly likely mean that your machine would therefore become available in this list and would therefore be discoverable by anyone on the internet. Shodan is a free service to sign up to. It does have some paid plans as well, but it means that this information is accessible to all. So really, cloud broker connections is all about removing yourself from the internet, removing that discoverability and kind of protecting yourself, not making yourself an easy target.
Can I just add to that we're picking on RDP here. There are plenty of VNC servers that are exposed to the internet, our recommendation for a number of years now has been use cloud broker connections if you want to connect across the internet, because it just gives you not only that lack of discoverability and you're completely masked from the internet, but also we also add additional role-based access control management features that if any existing customers haven't looked at our cloud broker connections, we would strongly recommend having a look at them if internet is required from the internet. Because, you know, Ben could have equally, just to be completely transparent, Ben could have done a search for 5900, which is the standard VNC RFB port, and we'd have found a lot of entries there as well. So, you know, don't be in that situation where your VNC servers are exposed to the internet. If you need that, there are lots of technologies you could use, but one of them that we would recommend is our cloud brokered connections.
Yeah, it's really all about using the cloud to your advantage to increase the security of your remote access solution. Thanks, Andrew. Over to you.
Okay, so policy sounds really boring. We need to talk about it because, okay, so we're talking about two different types of policies here. We're talking about enforced policies. So again, when choosing a remote access vendor, when rolling out remote access software and managing it, unless you're running on one machine, you probably have something like, if you're a Windows shop, probably something like Intune or group policy. You need to make sure that for your sanity, that the management of those machines to your corporate standards are enforced. You don't want users going and changing the configuration settings that might be opening you up, say, enabling direct connections where they're not authorized. So enforced policies would be things like, you know, group policy. So your remote access vendor should support those for the really key security considerations. And then we have soft policies, things like a remote access policy. And this is about having a policy and having staff training, standard IT practice, right? So staff need to know what they can do, what they can't do. If they need to do something, they need to ask questions of the IT team. If you have a BYOD environment, you know, what you don't want is staff going out there, installing some random remote access product that makes life easier for them. Then they go into the office, then they've invited their brother-in-law to connect to their machine to see something. Then suddenly they forget about that and their brother-in-law suddenly has access to your network. That's a situation you don't want. And a combination of enforced policies and soft policies, staff policies and staff training are really important. Again, talking about policies, the example I just gave, make sure that you know what software it is. And so this is not specific to remote access software, but make sure you know what software is installed on your machines that have access to your business data or your business systems. Audit that, and also have audit. So, you know, if there was a security incident, you need to be able to answer the question, who connected to this machine? Where did they connect from? What permissions did they get? With our technology, that all by default on Windows is logged to the Windows event log and is easily filterable. We have a knowledge base article on, for example, if you use a seam like the Elastic Stack, how to extract those events into a seam to give you that visibility. And whichever remote access tool you're using, the ability to audit not only the software installed on the machines and the configuration, but also connection data, right? Because you don't want to be in a position where you don't know what's happening on your devices and on your network and who's accessing your systems and your data. Okay, and handing over to Ben now to talk about remote access vendor transparency.
Thanks, Andrew. So this last point is the fifth step in selecting a remote access vendor, is really about getting independent security audits. So traditionally, annual penetration tests are quite often done by various vendors, sometimes for compliance reasons. However, quite often these are scoped to specific areas, and really what we're saying here is it's time to go beyond that. It's time to ask the vendor key important questions about have they had their security independently audited. It's no longer okay for a vendor just to say, yes, we are secure, tick, and brush that under the carpet. And so therefore at RealVNC, what we've gone ahead and done is a white box access all areas security audit. So we had Cure53, a Berlin-based security consultancy, come in, and they had full access to all of the VNC Connect software. So this is our source code, this is our internal documentation, our APIs, and also a direct line to the developers so they could talk to them and really get into detail about how VNC Connect was designed and built so they could do a full transparent security audit. And we are absolutely proud of our results. The management summary is available for those after the call. So we can send that over because we are, as it says, we are proud of our results. We're really happy with this security audit, and we are saying that it's time. It's time to ask vendors for that proof to really, enhance the credibility of what they're saying on their websites.
And I think just to build on that, remote access software is incredibly powerful. Potentially, it bypasses a lot of the security controls you have in place, like your firewalls, like, whatever security controls you have in place, remote access is almost certainly by design gets through them. So you don't want to install software with vulnerabilities or with unknown security credibility on your users' machines, on your personal machines, whatever. So in the same way as VPN software, for example, it needs to be secure. It's a security piece of software. Password manager is the same. You need to make sure that the password manager you're using either doesn't have backdoors, intentional or unintentional, or isn't spraying that data out, or doesn't have exploits that allow people to take over that stuff. So we think at RealVNC that the game really, given the number of cases we hear about remote access being implicated in data breaches, in cyber attacks, it's bad for the whole industry. And really, we're holding the industry to a new level of accountability and transparency and saying every remote access vendor should have this. And if they haven't, as a customer, you really should be asking, why haven't you got this? Because you don't know if there are any skeletons in the closet, if they can't back up their claims of, yes, we're secure, because of course they're going to say that. Okay. So that kind of does it for the 5 easy steps, although some of them may not sound easy. They really are the 5 areas that we at RealVNC, who've been doing remote access probably the longest out of any company out there, believe that really in 2022 need to be considered. So, you need to be thinking about encryption, what encryption is used, where it's used, is everything encrypted? Who owns the keys? Can the sessions be replayed now or in the future? Who decides who can connect to machines? Is it the software vendor or is it you? What ways do they provide for you to mitigate the human factor, the poor credentials, the poor password management that many people have? Layering that, do they support layering on authentication? So adding an additional requirement for an additional factor. So, okay, you've proved who you are through a username and password. Now show us something that you have, i.e. a cell phone or biometric data or a certificate, layer on that. Minimize your footprint on the internet by using cloud brokered connections. Obviously the cloud that the vendor is using needs to be secure, needs to be available. So in addition to the stuff Ben spoke about, also consider, what public, if they're using public cloud services, does that introduce any risk? Policies, both enforced policies and soft policies. Train your staff on remote access, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. Use group policy to centrally manage your configurations. And lastly, demand that your vendor proves their claims of security. And I think that's it for this session.
Great, thanks guys. So now we'll move on to the live Q&A session. Just a reminder, everyone, that you can pop your questions into the Q&A panel in the chat panel on the right-hand side of your screens. So I can see we've had a few questions in already, so let me kick off. Can you recommend a few password managers for a mid-sized organization? Don't know who wants to take that one.
That's a great question, actually, and it fits nicely into the authentication piece and mitigating the risks of users having poor password discipline. Obviously, password managers make it easy for users to have secure passwords and unique passwords per service. I guess it's a personal thing, but the ones I would recommend personally would be, unsurprisingly, the ones that have been audited to show that they're safe, which for me is 1Password and Bitwarden. Ben, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, they're great online solutions. I'd say there's also KeePass, which is available and has open source clients for those of you who wish to look in the source code and kind of verify any claims. But yeah, sure. The two Andrew mentioned, 1Password and Bitwarden plus KeePass, are all great solutions.
Great, thanks guys. Another one. So you obviously spoke on encryption a bit. Is 128-bit encryption secure enough?
That's a really good question.
Should I say that one? Yeah. So VNC Connect supports 128-bit AES connections for the client end-to-end connections, and absolutely, I talk about being secure out of the box. This is the default on VNC Connect, so absolutely 128-bit AES is secure enough. However, we also support 256-bit AES encryptions for those places where there may be for compliance reasons or policies set within the company that want that extra level enabled.
I guess just to follow on from that, and Ben's more of a cryptographer than I am, but I think 256-bit versus 128-bit is a certain amount of academic argument right now, because 128-bit is still secure.
Okay, great. And linked to, I guess, to the password question earlier, is it safe to store passwords in Google?
I.e. in the browser?
In the password manager that's built into Google Chrome, perhaps.
So I'll take this one. So I would say it's definitely better than having the same password everywhere. It's definitely better than having a bad password. But I would say that there is advantages to having some of the solutions that we already said. So for example, if your machine was compromised, they potentially can be extracted out from browsers. Malware quite often has built-in functionality to do that already. So we would, I can't exactly recommend vendors, but I'd say look at dedicated software that's built for the purpose of password management.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I can see questions flooding in. It's great.
Yes, I'm just trying to find my place in them again. So a question here, I think, related to public networks. How secure is the connection if users are on a public network remoting to a company network?
How secure is connections? So obviously we've had the answer to that is we've had all of our code audited by Pure 53, and we would strongly recommend reading the summary report which is available. And in addition to that, we actually have a security white paper which details the architectural decisions we've made and why it can be considered secure. So we would recommend those things. But obviously, if you want more detail, reach out to us, either our support team or our sales team, and we can have a further conversation about that.
Yeah, just to add to that, Andrew, I'd say this links in directly to that first section. So looking into end-to-end encryption, perfect forward secrecy, the more detailed of the encryption. What does encryption actually mean, and digging into the vendor to see what they support and how it works, how the solution works, because we can say that if you're on a public network and you're connecting through, there's no way to access the connection and see the data flowing through that.
Great, thanks guys. Just trying to queue up another question for you. As you said, Andrew, we've had quite a few in.
Good afternoon. How are you guys doing?
So, obviously more related to RealVNC, but I think an important question: how do RealVNC ensure that for successive client server software releases, regression's not introduced as a result of the changes to the software?
Oh, that's a great question, actually. I'll let Ben answer that one, because part of Ben's role is effectively security testing our software and looking at our software development lifecycle. So.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Andrew. So as Andrew said, a lot of it comes down to how is the software developed and what methodologies do they use to ensure security is built in from the start. I recently wrote a blog article on our website, available on the blog, which talks about this, talks about shift left, and talks about really, as I mentioned, ingraining security right from the beginning of the design process. So ensuring at the start of the SDLC, security requirements are being considered, and then as you go through security testing and different types of testing at the integration level, and then right through to the release. Of course, there's monitoring and post-release tasks. So more information is available on the blog, which I recently wrote, but a lot of it's down to asking the vendor how they develop software, how they ensure the security for software updates and going on in the future.
Super, thanks, Ben. Next question. I did just see it. Where has it gone? So again, related to RealVNC. With RealVNC, do you need additional sort of security tools on top of VNC Connect, or is VNC Connect enough?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think we kind of in a way covered that. So we provide a remote access tool, but we would recommend for enterprise customers, we would recommend single sign-on. So we would recommend, and it's new functionality that we have, but we would recommend if you're using Azure AD, for example, we would recommend authenticating your VNC accounts using Azure AD, because then you can layer on additional authentication constraints, conditional access, things like that. So that's one thing. The other thing is when I was talking about auditing, so if you have a large estate, you might want to have a SIEM to be able to pull in all the events of all the connections across your environment. So that's something a little bit outside of what we do, but we would strongly recommend that you have a SIEM in order to understand, as I said on the slide on policy, to understand who's connected to what, from what, and when did that happen. So, and Ben, I think you want to say something.
Yeah, so just to add to that, I was going to focus on direct connections. You absolutely can have a secure direct connection still. You absolutely can have a VNC connection on the internet in a secure manner. There's lots of built-in protections. So, for example, there's brute force protection to prevent brute forcing credentials. We talked about RDP not having that built-in. VNC software, VNC Connect, does have by default brute force protection to prevent attackers looping those credentials, trying different passwords until they potentially get in. Really, the cloud brokered connection slide was talking about removing that discoverability. If something's not on the internet, then you kind of remove a whole host of issues of it being out there.
That's a really good point, because in addition to the VNC server ultimately deciding who can connect and doing brute force protection through blacklisting accounts for a certain amount of time if there've been a certain number of authentication failures, our cloud services themselves also have, so we use a web application firewall, we use various technologies to, if somebody's trying to log into a VNC account, we have an additional layer on top which is doing that rate limiting and blacklisting as well.
Thanks, guys. Conscious of time, maybe we can get 2 more questions in. One is related to VPN. So, and I guess VNC's relationship with that. What about VPN? Is it the same as a cloud broker connection? And if you're using a VPN, which side's more important? Is it your side connecting to the clients, or is it the client side that has priority?
So a lot of our customers use the VPN and direct connections. So they effectively have a secure private network and they are running direct connections over the top. They are 2 different things. Now, obviously, if we think about one of the reasons a number of people choose to use remote access software like VNC Connect is with a VPN very often, and it's not always the case, but very often you're giving access to a network or a site rather than particular devices on that network. So if you consider data, for example, many of our customers, they have a machine on a highly secure network and lockdown network. They want to be able to access it, but they want to be able to control where that data is. In Europe, for example, with regulations like GDPR, where we really need to be worried about where we're copying that data, and privacy is becoming increasingly important. And organizations, for example, might have a line of business app, or they might have, Excel spreadsheets on a machine that they don't want that data leaving that machine and that secured network. So a VPN isn't great at doing that because you're giving access to typically the network or the site, whereas with remote access software, you're giving access to a device which is running the app, which is manipulating the data and display. So you can disable file transfer, for example. So we support file transfer. If you're worried about certain groups of users not being able to move data off the machine that's being connected to, you can disable file transfer, you can disable copy and paste to mean that that data is staying where it should be living and is controlled. So I think the use cases are slightly different. There are advantages and disadvantages of both, but most of our customers that choose remote access, it's primarily that it's about data, it's about running an application. So another example, actually a good example, might be you might be running a CAD system. That CAD system might cost millions of dollars and it runs on a very large machine, and you're not going to it might be a very computationally intensive application. It doesn't make a lot of sense for staff to be running the application at home, pulling data over the VPN. What you probably want them doing is having effectively the laptop or the device at home or in the office being a thin client, effectively talking to this large server and running the CAD application on this big, expensive central server. And one thing we haven't covered at all here is some of the additional server modes we have, like virtual mode, which if anyone's interested in, we can talk about, that are actually giving you a virtual session. So, we have different server modes on Linux that if anyone's interested in, we can talk about, that mean that doing exactly that kind of thing in high performance computing environments, it opens up, but that's not specifically security related. But, if anyone wants to have conversations about that, then, reach out to us, and we're more than happy to have them with you.
Yeah, that sounds great. And maybe just
Thanks.
Josh, I was going to jump in here. I've just seen an excellent comment. I was going to.
Yeah, by all means.
So Chris has said in the chat that ongoing audits are a good idea too. This relates to the last point where we talked about, going beyond the penetration test and talking about our, independent security audit that we did. Absolutely, ongoing audits are key as well. As the software change, as new functionality gets added, it's a key thing to keep those audits going and keep validating any security claims that the company makes. And there's no point sugarcoating the reports either. You want to see the details and see what things were found, and ask questions about those to ensure the vendor is as secure as it says it is. So yeah, absolutely, ongoing audits I think is a great thing, and we hope to see have more information on there in the future.
Great, thanks, Ben. So just conscious of time,
Can I just say, I saw a question somebody asked about differences with TeamViewer. My understanding, and please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but with TeamViewer, every TeamViewer instance gets a thing called a partner ID. And if you know that partner ID, you can effectively try to connect to it and then try using different passwords and things to try and connect to that device. With our cloud brokered connections, there is absolutely no way to be able to, how long is it's not possible because of the architecture of our backend services. It is physically not possible unless your account has been given access to that machine. It is just impossible to be able to connect to it. And other than that, I don't know enough about TeamViewer to know whether they support things like push notifications on connections and radius and certificate auth and stuff like that. But I think the other question I would ask is, have TeamViewer published a security audit where somebody has gone through every single line of their source code and validated it as secure? Because I would argue that from as far as we know, we're the first remote access company in our space, and lots of VPN providers have done it. But in terms of the type of remote access we do, we believe we're the first ones. And what we're saying is, everyone who uses remote access software should be demanding that. And if your remote access vendor can't give it to you and you're not using us, then come talk to us. That's really cheap.
Well said, Andrew. Well said. So yeah, obviously conscious of the time, I think we're gonna have to wrap up the Q&A here.
There was one more question that I just wanted to briefly cover. Somebody asked about automatic updates. Yes, there are plans for us to release that. The reasons we haven't done that are a lot of our enterprise customers, that's one of the first things that they disable, because they want to be able to test and confirm the software works. And if any new parameters are added or something and they're managing through group policy, they want to make sure that their policies support new versions. So there are reasons why we don't have it, but it is on our roadmap, and it will be coming out soon, as will quite a few other new features that we'll be really excited to talk about soon.
Absolutely. And I was going to say, obviously we haven't managed to get through all the questions that have been asked, and some of them are fairly technical sort of support questions or questions that our sales team will be able to answer. So for those that we haven't gotten through, we'll definitely prepare answers for them and come back to you on that. So yeah, that just leaves me to say, again, a reminder, we did record the webinar, so we'll be able to share this recording with you in due course. We'll also include a survey in that email that we send after the webinar. So do keep your eyes out for that. And if you could just spare a few minutes just to reply on that survey, that would really help us out to make sure that we give you the content that you want to hear, and we're discussing topics that you want to be a part of. So that leaves me to say thank you to Andrew and Ben for presenting today, and thank you to everyone else for joining the webinar. I hope you have a great rest of your days.